Now, Google tax is per se a digital service tax, a tax levied on digital tech giants or digital tech companies, e-commerce like Google, Amazon, Meta. Now, because Google is one of the predominant player in the industry and has the largest chunk of the revenue share, so in a common parlance, we usually call this as a Google tax, but this is more of a digital service tax or digital transaction tax. As of now, when we are talking about the applicability of Google tax, we have Google tax on online advertisement space, which is 6%. Now, whenever there is additional tax or tariff is being charged, of course, whenever the company is providing such services, they add these tax costs in their profit margin, which they want to retain. And whenever then they provide services, for example, to the Indian purchaser or to the end customer, it impacts the overall pricing, and therefore, for Indian customer or consumer, they have to bear the higher prices. When we are talking about the online advertising space, the tax rate applicable is 6%. And this is something when, for example, Google is charging revenue from the Indian purchaser of online advertisement. The Indian purchaser would withhold 6% tax when making payment to Google. But ultimately, it's the tax which is paid by the Google, and the way it is paid is that it is done by way of withholding. Whereas when the other tax on the e-commerce platform, for example, on Amazon US was applicable in India, which is now no more applicable. It has been abolished since 2024. This was applicable at the rate of 2%, which was payable directly by the end customer. There was no withholding tax which was levied on such taxes. Okay, so basically, this levy of 6%, which we are currently discussing in today's parliament, that we want to abolish 6% tax rate on online advertisement. Now, as you might have seen, there are two reasons basically to abolish this tax. In 2024, we have already abolished 2% equalization levy. Now we are looking at abolishing of 6% equalization levy on online. So overall, the idea is that we completely abolish the equalization levy, the digital service tax, completely remove it from the Indian domestic tax law regulation. There are two reasons. Of course, one is that there is a discussion, multilateral discussion going on with OECD and G20 countries. There are other countries which are also part. India is also one of the member being G20 nation. So there is a discussion of inclusive framework where the concept of market-based taxation is being talked about. So India being a market economy, whenever any company, US or European, is supplying goods to India, India should get a fair share of taxation, right? Because market of India is being used. So that discussion is ongoing. It's an inclusive framework where we have pillar one and pillar two. Pillar one is something where we're talking about attribution of profit for sale of goods to India, and pillar two is minimum corporate tax rate, which corporate has to manage, which is 15%, with some regulation that we're talking about. So there's a multilateral discussion which is going on. Second, and which is more currently in the news, is the ongoing discussion with Washington, the US administration of the tariff related measures, the reciprocal tariff, which would come into play from 2nd April. So that's discussion which Indian government is trying to do with US administration. And one of the reason may be, and that's a speculation, that India is removing the equalization levy because that was a long-term demand from US administration. There was also a proceeding which was started under the US Trade Act Section 301 by USTR, looking at this equalization levy as a discriminatory measure against the US company by invoking a unilateral action which India has imposed the equalization levy on the non-resident for the digital tech companies. See, as far as international implication is concerned, India is a part of G20 countries which is discussing this inclusive framework and this is at very advanced level of discussion. So India would want that this OECD BEPS action point, the pillar 2 and pillar 1, uh, is introduced, and is then gets the right to tax on the market share which any non-resident is selling goods to India. So this also is something which other European nation would want. So of course, a multilateral decision which is taken is much more beneficial in long run. Whenever we are taking any unilateral decision, it's first of all it's temporary, and it may lead to double taxation for the company. So as a non-resident, when I'm saying that India has a huge potential, please come and invest in India. At the same time, if I'm levying any unilateral taxation where it leads to double taxation for the non-resident, then it creates challenges to actually attract investment, to promote India as an investment destination. So it really serves us two purposes. One is that we are ready to move into multilateral discussion, which is already in the advanced stages of discussion, and also to show India as tax certainty and providing better tax regime, better regulation to a non-resident, avoiding any double taxation for them, is something which would have a beneficial picture of India per se. See, it's not much that they would be impacted, because what they have been doing as a practice is because they have sort of monopoly in the market. So whenever they used to deal with Indian market, they used to have this minimum profit margin they used to wanted to keep, and they used to increase the pricing of the goods. So overall, in terms of impact, there might not be much impact. But of course, there were a lot of local competition which was coming up. The Indian startup industry which was coming up were ready to compete with such giants. But now, reducing their tax impact, the US giant, the tech giants, would be at a better footing to actually compete in the Indian market, and it's actually beneficial for them. But at the same time, drawback for the Indian startup who are looking to compete with this giant, and margin of 6% and 2% might impact their profitability, and therefore their option to compete with this giants might come down. Okay, so there we have something called significant economic presence as an option. So, of course, India has its own domestic tax law, but what's happening currently is that this digital tax, because in the current tax regulation, read with the tax treaty you have with, for example, United States, you need some sort of presence in the Indian territory to really tax the business income in India. Now, this tech company, they don't really need any presence. Through the online mode, they can promote their business and get the business going in India. So, because of the current regulation, they're not able. Indian government is not able to really tax them. Now, with this significant economic presence introduced in the Indian domestic tax law, what government is trying to do is they're trying to create a situation where not only physical presence in India would be subject to tax in India, but also economic presence. So, for example, if any company has more than 300 customers in India, or is able to earn either from goods or services more than 2 crore and on annual basis supplies to India. So in that case, the company is set to create a significant economic presence. So even if you are outside this purview of equalization levy, the Google tax, you still have to see whether you're covered under significant economic presence. Having said that, now you have a tax treaty framework. So any US company, if covered under the tax treaty framework, there's something in the domestic tax law, but the India US tax treaty does not even allow India to tax those incomes. So they are still protected. And because the discussion is going on in the international framework, OECD, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, as I mentioned. So once the multilateral instrument comes up, then this domestic tax law really would help the India to really tax all those digital income. Okay, that depends really on whom you are asking this question. If you are asking um, a consumer like me, of course, when there's no tax, no tariff, the prices of the goods, etc., or the services comes down. So lower the tax, the better the price which company can provide to the end customer. But as I mentioned, the startup, etc., who were trying to compete with such tech giants, Now, earlier they had this advantage that 6% tax was applicable on Google. So they had the 6% margin which they can catch up. Now the 6% margin would go away, and therefore they would have some disadvantage by removal of this Google tax until and unless the OECD program and the multilateral instrument of Pillar 2 comes into picture.